The big part of my job was reframing the perception of arts as something that isn't for the elite or a side dish, if you will, but actually integral to the health of people and places. Integral to drives economic health, it drives individual health, it drives community health. I've always seen my role as a leader in creating more opportunity for art and artists through the strengthening of infrastructure, right? If I'm a really good administrator, we're not thinking about the administrative motor, if you will, right? That's quiet and humming along. And then it allows for this growth and focus on greater opportunity for the mission. The challenges were immense in that I had a lot of experience in working with a real range of personalities and creative people. I had never really run a business, right? And in the end of the day, a nonprofit is a business.
Welcome to Vida Brevis, a podcast about business, art, life, and death. I'm your host, Carlos Cardenas. Here we explore how business, creativity, and philanthropy intersect through the lives of remarkable people. I talk with entrepreneurs and community leaders who are passionate collectors and visionary patrons to discover how art shapes their work, purpose, and legacy. Because life is short, but art is forever.
Chers amis, queridos amigos, and dearest friends of the pod. Today's episode is a masterclass in the cold, hard, operational reality of how cultural institutions actually survive, scale, and build lasting infrastructure. My guest today is Mara Manus, who has built her career creating opportunities for artists and arts organizations. Mara is the founder of Manus Co. and one of the sharpest strategists working in the arts ecosystem today. Mara calls herself a business brain in the creative realm, and her path to becoming an institution builder is unlike almost anyone else in the field. She started her career in the high-stakes world of Hollywood production and studio management at Universal Studios, climbing the executive ranks, working with comedy legends like John Hughes and Chevy Chase, and she even co-produced the classic 90s film Above the Rim, starring Tupac Shakur. But after a stint doing civic volunteer work on Skid Row in Los Angeles, her career took a dramatic turn into the nonprofit sector. Mara stepped into the role of executive director at Chrysalis, a job training organization for the unhoused, where she scaled its budget fourfold, from $1 million to $4 million in just 4 years. That set off a powerhouse career of building, stabilizing, and expanding major organizations across the country. She's managed cultural loan portfolios at the Ford Foundation, served as executive director of the Public Theater, led Pioneer Works in Brooklyn through a $13 million historic building renovation, and also served as the executive director of the New York State Council on the Arts. As Arts Commissioner of NYSCA, the largest state's art agency in the country, Mara and her team completely transformed the state's cultural funding, blowing its budget up from $40 million to a historic nearly $200 million to support over 2,000 organizations and 500 artists across the state. In our conversation today, Mara breaks down her battle-tested rules for organizational health. We dive deep into why so many arts organizations face real strain after raising millions for ambitious capital projects, what she calls the shiny building trap, exploring why so many arts organizations find themselves in crisis after raising millions for spectacular architecture while completely ignoring the day-to-day operational budget needed to run it. Mara shares her golden rule of building on demand rather than on spec, and explains why leaders must cultivate a diversified capital base that views backend infrastructure not as suspect overhead, but as the actual engine of growth. We also talk about her recent expansion into Texas with Manus Co 2.0, where she's been working with groups like Fusebox, who are already doing really exciting work rethinking where and how art happens, from basketball courts to parking garages. She's built on that momentum through her consulting work with a focus on creating more opportunities for artists and arts organizations across Austin and New York. And we get into the growing body of data showing that cultural engagement isn't just nice to have, it's actually essential to public health, community trust, and civic life. Mara is a brilliant strategist who knows exactly how money, structure, and vision collide. Here is my conversation with Mara Manus. you started with the film industry, we'd mentioned. Were you living in Los Angeles? I see something about 7 years on the executive team at Universal Studios.
I definitely was living in Los Angeles. I was born and raised in New York City, never thought I would live any place other than New York, and went to Stanford. A friend of mine there convinced me that if I really wanted to be in the movie business, I had to give real consideration to Los Angeles. And I said, well, okay. And I just ended up getting one sort of production assistant job after another and realized in due time that I was actually living in Los Angeles. My inner New Yorker was wondering about that. But in fact, I ended up loving my life there. I really became, a half Californian in the process of that. I studied film and communications. Yeah. Yeah. My father was an entertainment attorney, and my mother was a geologist turned literary agent. And so I grew up in a family that in some way was very much serving the arts. I really did always think I wanted to be in the movie business, either as a producer or studio executive. I stopped out of Stanford for about a year and worked for a producer, probably the only successful producer, Marty Bregman in New York City. Learned so much just from kind of an administrative role in that company, but definitely didn't understand, and especially then, to what extent the movie business was really firmly and squarely planted in LA.
It sounds like you were immediately on the administrative side of that, right? But you went to film school. Did you sort of have to pivot from the mind of being a creative to being an administrator, or how did that happen?
I never thought of myself as an artist or a creator, but I love creating opportunity for art and artists. And that was, I think, a big part of my DNA, having grown up in the city and being exposed to arts of all kinds at a very young age. And so I always thought of myself as like the business person in the creative sphere. That's how I always thought of myself. I just immediately started basically working in the physical side of production, on the sets, etc. Before I became a studio executive, worked at Universal Television as a production coordinator on TV series. What was wonderful, I think, about that path is that I had a lot of production experience by the time I ended up in the studio position working with producers and directors who were making the movies. I was a reader and a story editor, which was considered development in the movie business. And so I had this kind of rich combination of both production and development. And it was a great ride and super amazing time. And
what era was this?
In the 80s and 90s. I did end up making a movie, co-producing a movie with that Tupac Shakur was in, called Above the Rim. We shot that in New York on a shoestring, and it did quite well. I mostly worked on comedies. I had the opportunity to work with a real creative genius, Sean Daniel, and a number of different heads of the studio, including Tom Pollock. Sean brought Animal House to Universal. It made, at a very young age, it made a fortune. And then he ended up as like the comedy genius. And so I started his sort of executive assistant, which wasn't a secretarial job. It was really a junior executive job. And it was great. I worked with John Hughes and Chevy Chase. Fun times.
So tell us about the transition from a for-profit industry, the film industry, and how you migrated into the nonprofit space.
Sure.
And what sort of, not baggage, but what are the sort of lessons you brought from the for-profit world that you brought into nonprofits administration?
I'm going to unpack this in a few ways. I never imagined I would be moving into nonprofits after the film industry. However, what happened was I had joined an organization called Chrysalis. I was on the board of it. It helped homeless people get jobs. It was based in downtown LA. I was mentoring a young woman in a public school system and to a program called the Fulfillment Fund. I was also making a short film for the Venice Family Clinic, the largest free clinic in the country, with this incredibly esteemed commercial director, Joe Pitka. And I was doing these projects just as a volunteer. And what I realized is how much resonance they held for me. When the executive director of Chrysalis was drafted to become one of the first staff members of AmeriCorps, which, if you remember, Clinton started, I thought, this organization is amazing. I bet I can help grow it. And I put myself up for the job. I, turned to my fellow board members and I said, I really think I want this job. And, I'm going to go through the same process as any other applicant. But I think they were not just surprised, I think they were shocked. After many, many interviews, probably more than I've ever had to experience for any other job I've applied for, I got the job. And the challenges were immense in that I had a lot of experience in working with a real range of personalities and creative people. I had never really run a business. And in the end of the day, a nonprofit is a business. I had the most extraordinary board chair who was actually head of the selection committee, Colin Shepard, who I'm still in touch with. He worked for Heinz, a big real estate development company. And he taught me so much about management. It was incredible. And he never told me what to do, but he taught me so much. And I felt like he was my first mentor. I remember him calling me up, I think within my first year, and he said, Mara, I have a question for you. And what's that, Colin? He said, do you understand that people don't like change? And I said, really? And that was really interesting because here I was at this organization making a lot of change, staffing changes, which I felt were going to be necessary to take this organization to next level. Anyway, I didn't know about change. I love change. I thrive on change. And so it was an aha moment, but it really opened my eyes to what else a manager has to understand in leading an organization. So what happened with Chrysalis is that we ended up growing that organization 4 times in 4 years. We grew up from like $1 million to a $4 million organization. We improved its impact and effectiveness. I think something that anyone running a nonprofit or any business actually is always thinking about is how am I serving my market and how can I be the most effective in doing that? And we moved from the goal from getting jobs to keeping jobs, because really ultimately that's how you transform someone's life, is that they can retain employment. And we had we opened new offices, one in Santa Monica, one in South Central LA, and actually came to the attention of the Peter Drucker Foundation that was showcasing exemplary nonprofits across the country. This is ultimately a big interest of his, this area, the sector. Anyway, so Chrysalis got a lot of attention, and there was interest in taking it to San Francisco, actually, from a group there, and I was interested in doing that. But the board really, wanted it to remain in LA and grow its impact there, which I completely understood. And that's when I left for the Ford Foundation.
Well, okay, so let's sort of, step back a little bit. Well, what's really interesting is this all came from a place of sort of an activism. I mean, you talked about fulfillment, and that's what initially drew you to Chrysalis and nonprofits in general. So I think that's really interesting. So it was more of a kind of a sort of
like a calling.
Yeah, like a sort of personal calling. I mean, you wanted to sort of do good in the world. God bless you. That's amazing. But then it's interesting because you still say that nonprofits are still a business.
Yeah.
So, and you talk about Peter Drucker and then, management principles. So, I want to sort of get back to this idea is like, what did you sort of bring from the sort of for-profit?
Yeah.
Like, are there particular strategies or mindsets that you brought from a for-profit business to apply to a nonprofit?
I think rigor is a core principle of mine. What are we trying to achieve, and how do we make goals and plans and processes around that? And certainly if you're making a movie, there's a whole pre-production, production, and post-production plan. And as a studio executive, you're also shepherding projects and trying to put them together to make the case to make a movie. I learned perhaps not about traditional management, but I had a lot of management experience in terms of managing processes and setting goals and making plans and et cetera, and driving them to its ends and driving them to fruition rather. But I will say this, and it's something I learned from actually one of our largest funders at Chrysalis, the James Irvine Foundation. They said to me, they thought we had a good thing too, right? They thought we had something that not a lot of other organizations were doing at the time. And they said, we're going to give you money for strategic planning. And then out of that, we're going to provide you with multi-year flexible funding, because this is going to be our investment to take you to new heights. And it was really fascinating to see how impactful that funding was and how important it was to build that infrastructure in order for that organization to reach new heights and to have an outsized impact and to deliver. And I will say this, that historically philanthropy has been obsessed about overhead, quote unquote, right? Treating investments in staff and infrastructure as suspect. While the private sector understands that those are the engines of growth, innovation, and scale, right? And this is not just a core part of my beliefs. It's really the core part of my work. The great visionary Darren Walker at Ford Foundation, 2015, launched something called Build. It was $1 billion play, if you will, investment in infrastructures. It was aimed at social justice organizations, but it basically gave them, huge investment in infrastructure in order to strengthen their outcomes, right, and their impact. It allowed the organization to choose. It was flexible funding, how they would use it, but it was all about strengthening their infrastructure. What I've taken to any leadership role I've walked into, and it's really been the appeal to me of those opportunities. When I went to the public theater, the goal was to stabilize it financially, but really, ultimately, I've always seen my role as a leader in creating more opportunity for art and artists through the strengthening of infrastructure, right? If I'm a really good administrator, we're not thinking about the administrative motor, if you will, right? That's quiet and humming along. And then it allows for this growth and focus on greater opportunity for the mission.
So are you more of a growth pilot or a fixer?
Yeah, I think I've always considered myself a builder. When I went to Chrysalis, it wasn't to fix, it was to build. I mean, I think, yes, you could say that there was elements that needed to evolve and be addressed. So I think a builder, a rebuilder, we did a lot of rebuilding, I think, at the public. But I've considered myself a builder, and that's always been the excitement for me.
Let's talk about a different kind of building. So I know, and we talked about this before, a sort of rule of thumb, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is something that you sort of have talked about on a couple of occasions, that when you are building an organization or a physical building, and we'll get to that, but you'd mentioned that you build for your audience needs, current concrete needs, all right, and not a sort of fictional based case scenario, and that you've seen organizations getting in trouble before because they're not sort of addressing a concrete need of their market. And that, you'd mentioned that there's kind of a trap, maybe thinking too far ahead, and, you sort of get into sort of fictional numbers and projections as opposed to taking care of business in the short term.
Thank you for that question. There is an allure, right, to building buildings. And I think, very much so, more so in the perhaps nonprofit cultural space. But I will tell you, this started, what I learned started in my time at the Ford Foundation. I had a cultural portfolio. I worked in economic development, and I had a portfolio of about 25 they're called culturally specific arts organizations around the country. They were dance, they were museums, they were mid-size. It was a phenomenal program. It was part of the Arts Stabilization Program that Ford had really launched very early on, understanding this need. And it was paired management consulting with capital investment, in this case, a PRI, program-related investment, a kind of loan. And so these 25 organizations, like half it seemed like were in some sort of state of crisis because they had built a building or expanded their facility and had with not enough evaluation on what it would take to really sustain that and what the implications were for the organization as a result of that. So an extreme example of this was the Folk Art Museum in New York City. They built a beautiful building that Todd Williams designed next to MoMA, and they hadn't planned for a big future. And ultimately, the building was actually taken down.
Torn down,
and the space was incorporated into the latest MoMA expansion. But it was, and that's an extreme example. But what I have said, and because I had my sort of 1.0 version of my consulting firm, and now we're in 2.0. But I had launched a number of nonprofits, and one of them, my parting words to the board was, please remember, the board was comprised of a lot of real estate developers, and I said, please remember to build on demand, not on spec. Yeah. And what I meant by that was make sure your audience is there, because your audience will build your building, and then you will have the audience and the support base to sustain your organization and that new part of your operation. It's very alluring and appealing for people to write a check for capital to, I helped build that building to point to something. But also there is, if you raise capital money from the government, that money is usually from bonds, right? So when I was in New York City at the Public, the city floated bonds to finance, and it was it was easier to float bonds than it was to take money out of the till, if you will, right? So there was an accessibility to capital as well that you can't refute. Build on demand.
Well, we can see the allure. It's almost like a shiny object syndrome, right? You see a big, beautiful building, it's very visible. But organizations need a lot of sort of back office infrastructure, which isn't visible.
Exactly.
And honestly, not terribly sexy compared to a shiny new building.
Yes, exactly. Yep.
When raising capital and for these nonprofits and you're trying to get them to do good for their market, right? Whatever audience they're addressing.
Right.
How do you convince investors to, I don't even know if we call them investors, donors. How do you convince donors that, hey, we have to finance stuff that's not sexy at all?
Yeah.
There's a mind shift there.
Yeah. It's interesting you just made that switch from investors to donors, because really what I believe is that if you take your business hat and you put your business hat on when you walk into the nonprofit door, right? You say, actually, nonprofits are nonprofit businesses. What you really are always looking for is a diversified investor base. That is exactly what I call it, diversified investor base, which means that there's no small gifts, but we need gifts at every level, and we need them to be sustainable year over year, right? Which is why I use the term investor rather than, donor. However, you asked about the appeal. And so I just want to point out that universities will not build a building and take a gift for capital unless it comes with a substantial endowment gift. And I think it's that kind of mindset that arts organizations should be thinking about. We cannot build this building unless we understand our projected expenses associated with this building in every way, not just our baseline to cover the cost of running this building per se, the facility, but what is the program that we're wanting to deliver in this building, and what is that going to cost? So what is that whole picture going to look like, that whole financial picture like? And kick the tires on those pro formas.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Pro formas are only as good as your best guesses, I guess.
Thank you for listening to Vita Brevis. If you know someone who would enjoy this conversation, please share it with them. A follow or review also goes a long way in helping us grow. Thank you. And remember, life is short, but art is forever.
You mentioned something interesting. You talked about endowments. I always found it interesting how some nonprofits, most nonprofits, sort of raise funds and then spend them and, sort of rinse and repeat every year. They do galas and, charity auctions and things like this. And on the flip side of that, you have the sort of endowment model, which I think is a little bit more rare. Can you talk a little bit about those two models and how they can coexist?
I think in the ideal scenario is that you have both, right? Is that the endowment throws off repeatable, projectable income year over year over year. And that, and you should not be spending anything but that interest income. And usually the charter of the endowment limits it to 3%, 4%, 5% sometimes. And so having endowment is, I think, an overall part of your income, but I don't think it's an either or. I think it should be both. I was very happy to hear that the Contemporary Austin has endowment. I wasn't aware of that. I listened to Debbie Dupre, big fan of hers, one of our great leaders in Austin. And so I was really excited to hear that they already established. I think there's an appeal to making endowment gifts as well for supporters and investors of nonprofits.
Well, for our listeners who might not know the nuances of an endowment, but correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially the sort of core principle is never touched, theoretically,
That's
right?
correct. Yes.
Yeah.
That is correct. Yeah.
So
and
it's an investment.
That's how it's created. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's basically a fund. It's a private fund that usually invests in, I guess there's a little bit of private equity, but for the most part, there are public equities, right? I mean, it would be managed by a wealth management firm.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
A team of professionals. Yes.
Yeah. So
Yes.
we're very far from, whoever the artistic director is there at the institution in question. All right. Well, listen, I wanted to bring up the New York State Council of the Arts, because I
Yep.
understand you were were you the director of that organization? The whole
I was
state of
the
New York?
director. Yep. I
Yeah,
was.
that
Yeah.
that sounds huge. And I know
Mm,
your budget went up like what, fivefold or something like that in the time you were there?
nearly, yes. Yeah.
Tell us about being pulling the purse strings for the whole state of New York's cultural activities.
Yeah. Thank you. It was interesting. When I was approached about the role, I, having been a grantee of it was called NYSCA is its acronym. Having been a grantee, I had a lot of questions about why they really wanted someone like me, because I consider myself you know, someone who leads change and evolution, and I'm entrepreneurial at my heart as well. So, but the interview process, proved out that in fact they wanted someone to take the agency to new heights, and that they would support me in that. And so I didn't think I would be there it's a commissioner position in the state, and I thought I'd be there for 3 or 4 years, but COVID hit, and anyway, I ended up for 7. I will say that it was one of the most gratifying professional experiences of my life, and I would also say that I learned so much more than I could ever have learned about how arts lives in communities of all sizes across a state that is so very varied in its everything. It's New York State is like 5 different states to me in terms of its regionality. But here's some things that. So how did we do that? How did we grow our annual appropriation from 40 million to almost $200 million? You know, what I realized in pretty short order was that even the word arts has inferences of exclusivity, implications rather. It's almost like a small door word. And if you use creativity, culture, even the parts of arts, dance, music, etc., I think people walk through that door, can see themselves in that life, and can also understand how it relates to them. And I really struggle with this, right? Here I am leading the New York State Council on the Arts, and I'm seeing sort of people's reaction to that word. And then I end up at a convening of the heads of state arts agencies, and there's a communications firm, and they're making a presentation about the word arts and its various inferences. And it was fascinating, and it was exactly what I just shared. It was that this word is limiting, and creativity is not. The big part of my job was reframing the perception of arts as something that isn't for the elite or a side dish, if you will, but actually integral to the health of people and places. Integral to drives economic health, it drives individual health, it drives community health. And then illustrating that through the many grantees, the thousands of, I think we provide support to 2,000 organizations at the time, and we grew our support to artists from like 100 to 500, and how that lives and the impact of that, and who I was in conversation with all the time was, when it came to the appropriation, was the legislature, right, the Senate and the Assembly, the governor's office, and then the Department of Budget. It didn't happen overnight. It was a process. It was extremely gratifying to move that needle in the way that we did, and I had an incredible team. We worked, and with a shout out to Megan White, my deputy director, and we did it. And I will say that any great leader really looks at not necessarily what happens when they're in office in that post, but also what happens after they leave, right? Because you want to leave and have the organization continue to soar. And sort of the best news I ever got was a year after I left, I saw that the governor's appropriation was still at almost $180 million for the year after I left, and I thought, okay, I did my job. I did my job.
Didn't Mom Donnie just pass a new budget for culture in New York City? Like a day or two ago.
Yeah, so the budget for New York City passed, and with a record high funding for the arts, which I was really happy to hear. So I will say that New York City has its own cultural budget and its own cultural affairs department. They have more money than the state does in terms of its funding. there's about 40 institutions that are part of something called the Cultural Institutions Group, and the city provides a significant amount of funding to those organizations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it goes way beyond, supporting the arts. I mean, how many millions, if not billions of dollars is generated for the city of New York, through the arts? People that go to see events at
Billions.
Lincoln Center. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the number's billions. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the arts, yeah.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, this is a very clear example of how investment in the arts sort of does trickle down, so to speak, to hotels, restaurants, all kinds of, sort of lifestyle businesses.
Yes, I would say yes, and certainly in New York City, undeniably, right? Undeniably, I wish I had that number off the top of my head. The economic engine that the arts drives in New York City, it is billions. But I would say also that if you go to other places, which I became very fond of Buffalo and Rochester and all these other cities in the state that have rich arts environments, and many of those institutions were started by industrialists who had done well, and they saw this as part of their civic duty. But also, I would say that when those cities lost some of their industries, the arts prevailed. And I will never forget this. I went to a show at Jiva Theater, and it was the middle of winter. It was like February, and I thought, I'm going to this theater. It's Wednesday night, nonprofit theater. I wonder how big the audience is going to be. I think the theater, if I were to guess, I think it held about 300 people or something. Anyway, it was sold out. The audience, it was sold out. They had two restaurants, like a cafe and a restaurant. They were bustling, and it was just. And I just looked around and I thought, this is you cannot understate the economic engine that the arts provide everywhere. Everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's interesting. And going back to this idea of, it's kind of easy to see how arts and culture, just backtracking a little bit, it's really interesting. You said earlier about the consultants talking about the language that we use, how the word art kind of alienates some people, where a word like creativity or culture sort of, opens doors a little bit. But anyhow, I digress. But it's easy to sort of see the economic engine of culture in a place like, New York or Paris or London. I mean, obviously people travel there to be entertained.
Right.
But then you mentioned places like Rochester and Buffalo, and that, sort of changes that a little bit. So the role of the arts is, maybe less direct to, hospitality revenue. You had mentioned that Manus Co, your consulting firm, is currently in a sort of 2.0 position. And I know you're spending a lot of time in Austin.
Yeah.
So tell us about this sort of 2.0 version of Manus Co, your consulting firm, and how does this activity sort of manifest itself in a place like Austin?
Yeah. So my husband, who's an architect, who has been building in New York, his name is Mark Dubois. He's been building in Austin for like 10 years or more, and he thought to open an office in Austin about 4 years ago. And he just enjoys the ecosystem in every way, the contractor designers, etc. And so I was leading pioneer work in Red Hook, Brooklyn, and I realized that I needed a more flexible life, professional life, in order to be with Mark on a more regular basis. And so basically, we launched Manus Co to do a lot of the same work that I have been doing on the inside, but maybe quote unquote from the outside, from a consultant's role. I would just say that really that our work is to build and strengthen the sector, and we do it on a sort of bespoke basis with 2 to 3 clients at a time in helping them grow and build resilience and get to new heights. And in Austin, I'm currently have the opportunity to work with Fusebox. Been around for 22 years. It's just moved into a biennial format. Ron is really just incredible creative genius, and the board wanted to engage me to help figure out it's kind of a resilient, bigger future for it. And what does that mean to move into biennial?
I was just going to say, Fusebox is based on performance, and the performing arts. And it's a very alternative kind of iteration of the performing arts here in Austin.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but I would say this about Fusebox. I'm loving working with Fusebox. I'm loving figuring out how it exists. What are the off years? What do we offer artists? But also, how do we build a resilience and infrastructure to it so that it can really soar and provide even more opportunity for artists in Austin and developmental work. So, but I will say this, like going back to earlier conversation about how do we define arts and what's the invitation? I've been thinking a lot about Austin obviously I've been there. I like Debbie Dupre, was surprised at the growth of arts and culture and creativity. Offerings were not on pace with the growth of the city. What's unique about Austin, but also how do we grow audiences in Austin and of these experiences? And what I really think a lot about, and I saw this infused in definitely a few of the offerings of the biennial Fusebox, which is, they're that they're not necessarily walking through a big formal door into a big formal building to sit and be absorbing arts in some way, to watch dance, to watch whatever, but in fact to experience arts in different settings. There was one of the things I watched this year at Fusebox was dance on a basketball court. The setting was actually a basketball court. It was a social dance. It was phenomenal. And everyone, dogs and kids, and it was a great, the audience. And it was an unexpected place, right? It was an informal place. I think when you think about that, there was a music. It was in a parking garage. There's a 32 channel sort of sound experience in a parking garage, and it was incredible in that I saw people choose their own experience of it. Some people were on skateboards, some people were on bikes, some people were walking around, other people just hanging out, sitting and talking and having the rainforest reverb around them.
Yeah.
And so I thought, this is arts, right? A long time ago, at the Public Theater, Under the Radar, presented a show at the Staten Island ferry terminal. And we watched performers with headsets. We were headsets, performers in the midst of this waxing and waning commuters, crowd that kept coming in and out. And it was wild. It was great. So I think, we have to think broadly and flexibly about how we define arts and what makes sense in a place that like Austin, that's certainly younger in all ways, certainly younger in its artistic growth as well, right?
Well, at Pioneer Works, the program includes the visual arts, different kinds of performing arts, and scientific research as well. I mean, that's fascinating, sort of mixing math and engineering with, the humanities. Tell me a little bit more about this idea of sort of cross-cultural pollination where scientists and avant-garde artists can kind of be relevant to one another.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I thought Pioneer Works is brilliant at doing what they decided to put under one roof. It was really an attraction to me in taking that post, which is, again, like, back to what is the invitation? The invitation is that you may go and learn about black holes, but on the way to that lecture, you may stop in and see, three artists in residence and want to learn more about their work. And so I think the mashup is really important. And I think it's also to your point, which is how do we take down the barriers to, or how do we invite in rather, people who would not say, I'm interested in art. How do we invite them in to those worlds? And I think that, Pioneer Work does a great job of that. And it was fascinating and wonderful to see. And I definitely wonder about, how we think about that in Austin. Well, this is not a complete digression, but what we're learning and what I actually launched at NYSCA, what we're learning is that engagement in the arts has scientific outcomes, if you will, has outcomes in both physical and mental health, positive outcomes, and that is a world that's actually already in action in Canada and England. Right, you can get prescriptions. Doctor can write prescriptions to go to art, and there's an organization in America that Chris Appleton founded called Social RX. And so I think it's focused mainly on mental health. But, when you think about the implications of arts engagement leading to better health outcomes, and then you walk that out to the money we spend on Medicare, Medicaid, so there's a whole, there's a lot of data on this already, and thinking about how we bring that to the fore with those who, again, think about art in a very sort of exclusive and separate way.
Yeah, it's a very different sort of way of looking at art, well beyond walking around Chelsea and looking at the commercial art galleries there. And, there is, a strong elitism there, right? I mean, it has its own value, but there's this idea of the value of art in a civil society. So you'd kind of touched upon this. Do we all need art? And if so, why?
When I think about arts, I don't think about like just that ballet performance or actually a great rock concert at Moody, right? I really think about walking my dog at Laguna Gloria in a sculpture park. Or I want to share two initiatives that we launched in New York at NYSCA when I was there. One was with the Department of Aging, and another was with the Department of Corrections. And in both cases, with aging, I said, we want to do this pilot. We know that it can have a positive impact on the health of seniors. We have a growing senior population in the state. And the commissioner at the time, and I wondered how long that conversation would take, because a lot of times creating collaboration across state agencies does not necessarily happen overnight. Anyway, in this case, it did almost happen overnight. Unfortunately, COVID hit, and so we had to kind of pivot in terms of the formation of the program. He understood it. It was like part of his knowledge base already. He said, absolutely, we have to do this. Let's do this in this many senior centers, and we have control over that many, and we're going to do X, Y, Z. And we came up with the program, and it was super exciting. So I would say in that case, there's someone who actually understood already, right? That actually, yes, that art, and not just art therapy for one, specific part of the senior population, but for the whole, was actually going to have incredibly positive outcomes. With Department of Corrections, there was a real interest, especially with the youth population in the correction system. What can we bring to them? And that program that we started there at that time. I'll just talk about the youth facilities that we brought our program into, and that was incredible. And it changed not just the young people who were in prison. It kind of reframed their perception of themselves, because here we were sort of drawing out a talent perhaps that they had never had an opportunity to experience. But also really changed the culture at the place, because it helped the staff see these young people in a different light as well. And it was really profound. So back to why do we need art? What I will say is that through my experience in the state, through funding, through seeing what funding artists, providing support to artists, and its sort of outsized impact on the health of a community. And when I mean health, yes, there's individual health, but when you think about community health and trust, and really arts, I think in some way creates the community, right? And at a time, well, certainly we're living in complicated times right now. I think art brings people together in extraordinary ways, but it also lifts people up. I mean, there's so much information about, or data about, how it grows our brain, our creativity, our executive functioning, et cetera, et cetera. And so, it is my hope that I can play a role in growing what I know to be a critical driver of health in our city, a critical driver of what it takes to be a great city in many ways, right? I know if you think about New York without the arts, I mean, you can't even imagine that city. When I think about Austin and the richness of this place, it's really undeniable. At the same time, it's a relatively young city in terms of multi-generational wealth and philanthropic investment. And this is really what draws my interest, not only in growing philanthropy in Austin, but in strengthening support for the arts. And I think we can all agree that a great city is not built on infrastructure alone. It's shaped by imagination, creativity, and cultural vitality. And those are the forces that transform a city into a truly exceptional place.
I think that's a great place to stop, Mara. Thank you so much for your time today.
Okay. Thank you, Carlos.